I just wanted to provide a very quick introduction. I'm Mary Carson Stiff. I'm Director of Policy at Wetlands Watch. We're a nonprofit based in Norfolk, Virginia, working statewide on sea level rise adaptation and floodplain management. And so I know many of you from ASFPM and VFMA. And I serve on the Virginia Floodplain Management Association board. And we are so happy to have VFMA hosting this event today. They are going to be in the driver's seat for this Zoom meeting. And so without further ado, I want to introduce Kristen Owen, who is the floodplain manager for Henrico County up near Richmond. And Kristen was formerly with DCR and was the acting NFIP coordinator for the state for about 1.5 years and was with DCR prior to that. So Kristen is the VFMA president, and we're really grateful for her leadership in the state. And I know that we have some people joining us from outside of our state to hear about this exciting new funding opportunity for floodplain resilience and floodplain management in Virginia. So Kristen, thank you for being here and for being our host today.
Great. Thank you, Mary Carson, and thank you, Wetlands Watch, for letting us use your Zoom platform to host this. We're very excited to be able to partner with the Secretary's office to give you this opportunity to hear about the Community Flood Fund and the Coastal Resilience Master Planning Framework. Today's event is going to be recorded, and we'll have the video of that available on the Wetlands Watch policy page, and we'll also make it available on the VFMA page. So VFMA is the state chapter of the Association of State Floodplain Managers. We are the Virginia Floodplain Association. We work a lot with local floodplain managers, but we also have a lot of private groups that are members of our organization as well that focus on floodplain management the Commonwealth. So today's focus, we wanted to partner with the Secretary's office to give a platform for the local floodplain managers to have a discussion and provide feedback, because the legislation that created the Community Flood Preparedness Fund actually calls us out specifically as local certified floodplain managers. So we want to make sure that you're aware of that and that you are paying attention to this new opportunity and can get involved to help shape this new program for the state. So we have Deputy Secretary of Natural Resources, Joshua Sachs, with us today. He's going to give a brief presentation on the Coastal Resilience Master Planning Framework and the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. And then after that, we'll have a discussion and a Q&A session with him. We have a chat feature through Zoom that we'll be using for questions. Feel free to post your questions throughout his presentation, and then we will moderate that discussion at the end. We also may provide an opportunity for you to just unmute yourselves and discuss, but for the meantime, we're going to keep everybody muted while Josh provides his presentation for us. So we have until 1:30 today, so we'll go until then or until the conversation ends. But for now, I will go ahead and turn it over to Josh. Thank you, Josh, for being here, and we are excited to hear from you.
Thank you, Kristen. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. As you heard, I'm the Deputy Secretary of Natural Resources, and that means that I have the privilege of working on a lot of things related to resilience, to land conservation, climate adaptation, and I get to help Secretary Strickler, who is also the Commonwealth's Chief Resilience Officer, and Rear Admiral Ann Phillips, who is our Special Assistant for Coastal Adaptation and Protection. And I sort of am the third member of that team trying to help put together what is a pretty robust and complicated set of new initiatives regarding resilience in the Commonwealth, Virginia. And I'm so happy to be here to talk to all of you about that today. But before I get into all that, just a couple quick things. First, I also want to echo thanks to Wetlands Watch, to Skip Stiles, their president, and to Mary Carson and the whole team there. We are, as I said a moment ago, trying to do something very big here in Virginia and initiate a lot of programs and a lot of change very quickly to help make up for lost time with regard to resilience. And to do that, we need to do many things, and one of them is to make sure that our stakeholders and our participants are fully briefed and fully aware, and we wouldn't be able to share all these updates without the help of groups like Wetlands Watch. We're planning webinars like this, so thank you. I also want to thank the VFMA and Kristen and floodplain managers generally. some of you have heard me at either VFMA things or other presentations say that I really believe floodplain managers are sort of the unsung heroes of these resilience efforts. And that might sound silly to all of you because you know who you are, and you're certainly, why would you be unsung? Well, in a lot of the rooms I'm in, floodplain managers aren't necessarily the first type of people who are thought of to be consulted. But I really recognize that without everything you're doing to map our floodplain, to keep communities in compliance, that we'd be far worse off. So thank you to everyone for all you do and for joining us today. So with those things out of the way, I'm going to try to explain 2.5 years of work in 10 minutes or less. Let's see how we do. So if we can go to the first slide here, please. This all starts with the creation of Virginia's Coastal Resilience Master Plan. And I want to be clear from the beginning, the flood fund we're going to talk about and the flood remedies we're going to talk about are statewide ideas. But as many of you can imagine, our coastal zone is under specific and tremendous risk, and it is our most populous area of the state. So we started by saying we need a master plan for the coastal zone, and we'll grow from there. And in creating our coastal master plan, we came up with the 5 concepts you see right there, which we believe to be guiding principles for everything we do, and not just for coastal flooding and the coastal master plan. I think those are concepts that can be infused through all of our flood work and will be used to inform the fund. So quickly, those are acknowledge climate change and the science behind it. I don't have to tell all of you that may seem obvious, but that has been a challenge even in recent years. We want to enhance equity. We want to make sure that every community is given abilities to improve resilience, that there is no community left behind. We want to use nature-based solutions whenever we can. I believe that nature is the best flood control money can buy, and it's already there and gives us tremendous additional benefits. We want to use regional and community scale approaches whenever we can. And we don't want to go house by house and elevate. We want to protect whole communities, their roads, their workplaces, their homes, etc. And last and not least, we know that this is a problem of tremendous need, tremendous financial need, and we need to find cost-effective solutions. So you go to the next slide for me, please. From those, we extrapolated 4 sort of goals out of those principles. They sort of track, and they are identify and prioritize projects. We want to figure out what things we can put on the ground that are going to give the most benefit for reducing flooding. We know we need to have a financing strategy to pay for all those things. As I said, we want to recognize climate, and that means when it comes to goals, actually using climate change projections. And we know we need to coordinate our efforts. We know that localities are working to reduce or to improve resilience in some cases. The state is, there are federal programs, there are academic institutions. We need to do our best to harmonize all of that. So you'll take me to the next slide, please. In the coastal zone, for our purposes of our master plan, similar to many other master plans you've seen across the country, we need to divide the state into regions. And I won't go into detail, but you'll see we've divided our coastal zone into 4 regions. On the next slide, you'll sort of see a rubric for how this is all going to work. So we've put out an RFP to hire an engineering firm to do consulting. We're doing outreach through sessions like this and many other avenues. And we've created something called the Technical Advisory Committee, which is made up of academics, PDC representatives, floodplain managers, and others who are going to help us figure out how to create and implement our master plan and how to spend money to improve resilience broadly. Our goal is that in spring, pardon me, let me pause and say we're going to fund all of this primarily through money that comes from auctions of revenue from auctions from selling credits for carbon reduction from RGGI. We are going to dedicate 45% of our revenues from RGGI to resilience, and we anticipate that's somewhere north of $50–60 million a year. We're also going to create something called a coastal relocation handbook, a guidebook to help communities relocate people, homes, sets of homes when possible. And all of that will lead to a master plan in 2021. Why am I telling you about all of that? Because ultimately, we're going to use the master plan in the coastal zone to help us prioritize funding for the Community Flood Fund, which we're about to talk about. So next slide, please. Again, just another diagram here to show you that master plan I just described that will help dictate how we fund projects out of the fund is going to be something that is updated regularly. So the process I just described will sort of reboot every 5 years, and we will keep having an updated master plan. Next slide, please. So now here we are at the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. The reason, again, I started with the master plan is the flood fund and the master plan were sort of created in concert with one another. And the flood fund, which was created by legislation just January of this year, was designed first and foremost to fund the master plan and also to fund flood resilience across the rest of the state. So like our master plan, certain parameters come into play. And first we had 4 parameters that were set by the legislation. 1, we have to use the money for flood prevention, first and foremost. Flood control shouldn't be a secondary benefit of a project we fund, it should be the primary benefit. Second, we want to prioritize those community scale and nature-based projects I talked about earlier on. Third, the General Assembly requires that we use 25% of the funds for low-income communities. And we've said that we will either spend that 25% in any given year, and if for some reason we don't have the right mix of grant applications or we don't have enough to fill that 25%, we will hold the money and expend it in future cycles. So we will guarantee that that 25% remains whole no matter what. And last, we want communities to target their projects towards areas that are known to recur and flood regularly. And as you can see, we want floodplain managers, we want all of you to be the ones who get to tell us, who tell the localities you work in, what those areas are. We want science to rule the day, and we believe you're the experts in that. So if we go to the next slide, please. Of everything I've told you, we extrapolated a program goal, and I'm going to read that to you. The goal of the Flood Fund is to provide support for regions or localities across Virginia to reduce the impacts of flooding, including flooding driven by climate change. The fund will prioritize projects that are in concert with local, state, and federal floodplain management standards, local resilience plans, and the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. The fund will empower communities to complete vulnerability assessments and develop and implement action-oriented approaches to bolster flood preparedness and resilience. I think that should mean more to those of you who are floodplain managers than it does to most people. There are tremendous roles sort of baked into that mission statement for people who do what you do. So next slide, please. Now let's have the rubber hit the road, so to speak. This is the question that people usually ask me about first, but I've saved it till slide 8 or so. And that's where are we going to put the money? And there are 3 buckets of money for what we're going to fund. Let me say first, I understand there's a great desire across the Commonwealth to do and implement projects, and we share that desire. We want the majority of the money from this fund to ultimately help finance projects that are going to protect people and property. That said, you can't just run out the door and start putting projects everywhere without careful thought and planning. And we want to make sure that communities have the wherewithal to do all of those things. So first, we're going to fund planning grants. 1, we think every community needs to have some type of resilience plan before they start getting projects funded by our flood fund. Some communities already have wonderful plans. I'm thinking of Virginia Beach and Dewberry. Some communities have plans that may need a little bit added to them. Some communities may not have plans. If you are a community who cannot afford to do this type of planning, the Commonwealth will provide planning grants for you. We will also provide grants for all the other type of planning things mentioned, technical staff training, regional flood studies, delineations, etc. Let me say one more thing about the technical staff training. If a community needs certified floodplain managers, if a community needs to hire consultants to write them a resilience plan, those are things we think are really important and should be funded by the state. I think that the state offers free floodplain manager training. I think a DCR does that at least once or twice a year. So that's another option. After planning, studies, and data collection, we need to know what we don't know before we can plan. We know we need better precipitation modeling. We know we need statewide rainfall data. We may go to a locality and they might tell us they need a better network of stream and tide gauges. We want to fund all of those things. And then last but not least, projects. The first two bullets you see there are meant to encompass basically your green infrastructure and your gray infrastructure. We want both. Both are going to be needed at various times. I think we prefer green, but we understand there are instances where we just need a levee or a hardened flood wall or something. We also want to make sure we're funding stream restoration and stabilization, public outreach. Earlier, I mentioned buyouts, relocation, strategic relocation. That would certainly be covered under projects as well. So next slide, please. Grant award criteria. We're still trying to figure this out, but again, first criteria, please be sure your project is part of some kind of cohesive plan. Each year, the grant manual that we put out is going to detail different cost share ratios used to push the money towards projects we think are most important, to help communities who can't afford to fund projects get an adequate share of funding. Cost share is something we will incorporate going forward. As I said before, in the coastal zone, projects are going to be prioritized by the master plan once it's developed. Before then, I think we're happy to fund some projects that aren't necessarily part of the master plan, but certainly projects that meet the other values I've described. Again, back to the cost share, we will consider fiscal ability to pay. And then you can see below that some details on our minimum grant awards. Those are designed simply to ensure that we're not flooded with small number grant proposals in a way that we can't accommodate. We haven't set a maximum for grants. We are discussing whether or not that if you had say a $10 million project, we would, ask you to apply in tranches, or we would ask you to apply once and issue a grant with a payment plan. There's a lot of options on the table, but we didn't want to set a cap. We want to pay for whatever makes the most sense and is going to help Virginia the most. And last but not least, but while I said before, Reggie will capitalize this fund, do not assume that the total amount that we bring into the fund in any given quarter will then be expended in grant rounds. It will be the determination of the secretary, the chief resilience officer, and others on how much we spend in a given grant round. I think that's designed to weigh need and also to realize that this may take some time to get up and running, and that's okay. So next slide, please. Couple other details. We're going to do 2 rounds of this grant every year. We're going to do one grant round that runs from April to June with August awards, and a second from August to December with December awards. I don't know when the first round will be or whether we'll do some kind of shortened grant round to get on track. And I wouldn't presume that we will be doing the first grant round necessarily April 1st, 2021. I just don't know the answer to that. You can see I've detailed eligible entities here, groups who can apply for these funds. That will be localities, PDCs on behalf of localities, soil and water conservation districts, and tribal governments. We have not right now included nonprofits and academic institutions. Happy to hear your thoughts on that. As I said before, we'll have an annual grant manual and RFP that'll add more details to this. These guidelines are sort of meant to be top tier, setting the program course for years to come. And if you could go to the next slide, this is sort of my last slide. This is details on how one might comment. If you have formal thoughts, if you have ideas on how this money should be spent, or what a minimum plan should be for the local resilience plans or grant timing, or anything else, we'd love to hear from you. We're going to dialogue today. I'm going to answer questions and I'd love to hear thoughts, but that is not the same as formal public comment. So by all means, please submit formal public comments if you or your organization is interested and the information is there. So with that, I recognize I've gone through a lot of stuff pretty quick. I've probably left a few things out and I've probably said a few things inartfully. I apologize, but at its core, what I want you to see is in just a few years, Virginia has gone from very little to a lot of resilience planning. And we've tried to create a web where these things are meshed together and can really build off of each other. We think that we are going to have a fair amount of money to play with based on the funding sources I've described. And with that, we want to hear from you what you think we got right, what you think we need to fix. And frankly, I recognize some things have not yet been answered. That is probably on purpose because we haven't figured out the answer yet. So, by all means, please help us with that too. So I will pause and catch a breath and turn it back to Kristen, who I think is going to help moderate this, or Skip. Forgive me, I'm confused.
Yeah, I will. Thank you, Josh. That was very helpful and a great overview of the flood fund. So I believe Mary Carson posted in the chat. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat. Also, if you don't necessarily have a question, but you just have thoughts or ideas for how the flood fund could be used, or thoughts on outreach of how the Secretary's office and the state could be continuing outreach with communities on this fund and the new guidelines and the process, please share that. They're really interested in just any kind of feedback that you can provide for them. So I'll go ahead and get us started. We have a few questions, but one question I wanted to pose to you, Josh, just for clarification purposes, because this came up in our other event last week. The flood fund legislation says specifically that flood prevention and protection projects and studies in areas that are subject to recurrent flooding as confirmed by a locality certified floodplain manager are eligible for funding. So can you explain to the group what that means? Who would be considered a locality certified floodplain manager?
That would be someone who is serving in the role of a floodplain manager for a city, town, locality, whether or not they have the letters behind their name. But whomever is serving in that role is helping to delineate the floodplain and understands best where the flooding is happening.
Great. Thank you. So I know there was some confusion on if that meant if you were a certified floodplain manager through ASFPM and you have that license, or if you're just the locality floodplain manager. So we wanted to make sure that was clear because we know many of our localities do not necessarily have a CFM on staff, and we don't want that to be a deterrent for this. However, as Josh mentioned, you could potentially use this grant to get funding to build staff capacity, to get CFMs on staff or do training or things like that.
And I think you should. I'm not a CFM, but I want to be. I actually hope to be one before I leave this job. And I understand it's a week or two. So if you're able to, go for it.
Yeah, great. Okay, so one question we got, which I believe was related to the Coastal Master Plan framework, and Kurt, feel free to clarify if it is. So Josh, I don't know if you can answer or not, but the question was, when will you announce the engineering firm that's selected? And I think that was in reference to the RFP for the plan. Yeah,
forgive me. I am not the lead on staffing the RFP. I believe it has a due date. I don't know that due date offhand. But then I imagine, our desire is to get that firm up and running as soon as possible. So I'd happy to follow up later, but that's the best I can do right now. I apologize.
Great, thanks. And I see Kurt shaking his head, so I think that was an answer for his question. Okay, so one question that we have as well is just, this is more of a discussion for those of you from localities that are on the call. Oh, actually, sorry, I'm going to skip that one and ask this next question before we go into more of a discussion. So Gloucester County has said they have many roadways that flood during nuisance flooding events, And VDOT insists that roadway flood improvements are the locality's burden to bear. Will the process include or encourage VDOT participation and provide potential funding for roadway flood resiliency?
It's a great question. So first, I don't work for VDOT or the Secretary of Transportation, and I can't necessarily say too much about what they will and won't do, but they are represented on the Technical Advisory Committee. They are our partners in the federal family. We work with them regularly. I think that we want to help fix the road problem for sure. And we will make funds from the Community Flood Fund eligible for uses like that. That said, we want to primarily fund other unfunded uses first and foremost. So something like roads and highways has funding sources through VDOT, through Federal Highway, through others. I'm not an expert in highway funding, but my understanding is there's a lot of money for that type of stuff. And whenever possible, we'd like to either pair with or have those be the primary source for those projects. And I think the way you'll see that is in how we implement the cost share vis-a-vis those types of projects. I think they may not get as generous a cost share as some other things, but I don't know that yet. Nothing is set in stone. It's just a potential. Again, all that said, in a perfect world, we're doing a more community-wide approach where we don't have to elevate a road and then a building, but we're doing more bigger approaches kind of at the water line that will help protect everything behind it. But short answer, yeah, we'll help with that stuff when we can.
Great, thanks. Okay, we have a couple questions from our friends in Massachusetts. One of those is just curious as to the period of performance for the grants. Will these be allowed to be multi-year projects? Is there a max time frame for the grants to take place?
This is what is so amazing about creating a new program of this scale is we get to sort of decide, not me per se, but we, the Royal We, gets to decide this stuff. And we haven't yet determined that, we know we want to fund big projects that will necessarily take many years to construct. We have to figure out whether we want to fund them, as I said before, sort of in tranches through multiple grant rounds. We want to fund them in one grant round and do a payment plan. I don't know, but I do know that we want to find a way to make the types of projects you're describing, the types of projects that are going to take many years and maybe multiple payments, we still want to keep those in play and we want to have those happen. So, we're going to work out the details, but in essence, yeah, we're going to do something like that.
Great. Thanks. And I would just add for all of you schmoes that are on the call, because I see some of you that are, for those of you that aren't a schmo, that is the State Hazard Mitigation Officer. Those of you that have experience with these grants, similar grants like the FEMA grants that do multi-year, please provide public comment on this to help shape this program, because your expertise, I think, will go a long way on what maybe could work or what we should try to do different or better. This is really an opportunity to help us kind of fill in some of those gaps that the existing grant programs have and make it work for what we need to do to address flooding.
Also, full disclosure, where I'm from, schmo is an insult.
Okay, so another question is, how much annual revenue do you expect to have each year for this grant?
Like I said, this grant program will get 45% of the revenues from Reggie auctions. Those happen 4 times a year. We had projected that we'd be getting around $4 per ton, and that would bring us somewhere around $50 million into the fund. What I can tell you is that based on the Reggie auction that just happened, prices are holding stable and higher than we had anticipated, about double what we had anticipated there. So, I don't know for sure, but I anticipate $75 million or more.
Great. Which is way more money than we've ever had for really anything flooding related. So this is why it is such an important opportunity for all of us to be providing feedback and shape this program. This is very, very exciting.
I'm sorry, Chris, for those who don't know, for those who maybe aren't from Virginia or haven't followed, the Community Flood Preparedness Fund replaced another flood related fund that, as far as I know, was never ever capitalized, even though it existed in law. So just that pivot to having a fund that actually has money is a pretty huge deal.
Yes, yeah, because the fund it replaced did not, it never had funding, and it never had like guidelines created or anything. It was basically just written into law. So this is very exciting. We've made a lot of progress in a short amount of time. Okay, so this is not so much a question, but a comment, and perhaps you can elaborate a little bit more on the cost share component. But we have a comment from Bristol that was, as far as grant requirements, it would be good if there's no local match required due to budget constraints at the local level, especially for small communities. So is that something that's been a consideration? I know you said the cost share would be on a sliding scale, and there's a certain amount of funding dedicated to low income areas.
I'm not sure I caught that. Say it one more time. What is the crux here?
That it would be nice to have no local match requirement for this, especially for small communities.
So hello to Bristol. You are so far away from here. Yeah, it's a great question. And we understand that there are some communities who even any match is restrictive or an impediment, and we want to deal with that. So I think you'll see a couple things. First off, I don't think that, I don't know for sure, but my guess is that there will not necessarily be one match for all things. I think different kinds of grants may receive different types of matches. I also think that we could consider, setting certain thresholds for where there will be no match. We also have the ability out of this fund to provide loans at no interest or low interest, and we could do those for these communities. But I guess the answer is while we haven't figured out all the details, yes, we want to make that happen. We're going to have to figure out what's reasonable. I'd imagine that a lot of people want everything to be no match. We're going to have to draw a line somewhere. But yes, we want to do that. And for towns like Bristol, submitting comments and letting us know what types of things specifically you would want to be funding with no match is really helpful to us as we develop this. So thank you for that question.
Great, thanks. And I would just reiterate that to all of you communities on here, if you have thoughts on things like that, of what would be really helpful for a no match, especially like the staff capacity building and training, that might be a good one to start thinking about that and kind of reflect on your program and your budget and what might make sense. So another question we received is, it included the local match requirement, but will PDCs be able to apply for more than $25,000 in planning grant funding to cover multiple localities?
Yes. So the goal here is we want money to go to where it needs to go on the ground or to the localities to implement things. But we understand that there are certain localities that just don't have staff capacity or things like that. So to the extent a PDC can act as the umbrella, can apply for grants on behalf of one or more, I don't think it matters if they bundled or they did it as individuals. Yes, we want to allow for that. We think that's going to be essential to helping every community harness this money.
Great. And this is a follow-up question that I have. So Mary Carson, this one's not in the chat, but some of the FEMA grants, they have a planning component, which sometimes is called advanced assistance. And so if you apply for that to do sort of the first phase of planning out what you might do, then you can come back in and apply in the next round for the actual project. And, that might help you be prioritized for that project funding because you did the first set. Is that something that's been considered for the Community Flood Fund? If communities come in and do the planning grant the first round to get their resiliency plan and everything set up and identify projects, would that help them in the next round when they come in for project funding?
Yes and no. So it will help them in that we're going to make it a requirement that you have to have a base level plan, to get any money out of the fund. So if we're doing like a community-wide resilience plan, that you just need, and then you can go ahead and apply for anything else. If you were to use a planning grant to scope out a particular project to deal with a particular issue, and we gave you grant money for that, I wouldn't assume that it meant you were guaranteed, project funding next. I just don't know yet, but otherwise, we want to give everyone planning grants. We want to give everyone project grants.
Great. Okay. We have a few different questions that are similar, so I'm going to kind of merge some of these together. One of them came from FEMA, one came from Gwen in Hampton, who's a local emergency manager, and one came from Robbie at VDEM. So this is kind of looking related to the Community Flood Preparedness Fund and FEMA grants, specifically the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities BRIC grant. Was this designed to be a match towards FEMA funding or other federal funding? The FEMA grants require a 25% local match, and many of the localities don't have the capacity to meet that match requirement. So is that something that's been considered for this state fund, that localities could use it to meet that match requirement for FEMA funding and be able to do larger scale projects that way?
Yes. While I wouldn't necessarily say it was designed for that explicit purpose, it is commonplace to use state grants to pair with federal grants to accomplish various matches and things, not just in this space, but in our land conservation grants and water quality thing, all sorts of stuff. So yes, like most other programs we run, our anticipation is you could use match from our Community Flood Fund to match a federal grant.
Great. And I would just add on that
project and a local match, same kind of idea.
Yeah. And I would just add that each of those federal programs are a little bit different in terms of what they require documentation wise for the cost share and what their performance periods are. So I think, again, those of you that have experience with those, like Robbie and Joy and the local EMs, and if anybody is on here from Army Corps, what your projects require, that would be really good public comment for this, so that the state has an understanding. For Army Corps, they really just require a cost share agreement signed, and it's typically a 1-year thing. For the FEMA grants, it's a little bit different. So what kind of documentation would we need on the front end for that application for FEMA to give you that award for that match if you were going to use the state funds? Because it'll get kind of tricky of trying to use these different funding buckets to meet all of those requirements, but I think it's doable if we can just make it work. So we need your expertise on this.
Let me also, okay. I'm sorry, Kristen, if I could, just a quick thing is, we understand also that to implement a program of this scale, we need staff. We can't do it with our existing resources. So our intention is to hire some grant managers, an engineer or two to help evaluate projects. In addition to the ongoing capacity building we're doing at DCR Dam and Floodplain, just to help communities engage the CRS, compliance visits, et cetera. And through that additional capacity, if we got to a place where we started to regularly issue grants that could be used as a match, if it would be as simple as those of you at VFMA telling DCR, kind of this is the form we would need every time we match this type of thing, and we could develop that and sort of make it a little bit routine.
Great. And just kind of bouncing off of that, from the last call we had about this, Josh, did you say that the guidelines would be updated every year by DCR, or the grant manual, I guess, every year, so there would be an opportunity for some changes? Yeah.
So look, we're creating a pretty big grant program out of whole cloth. And you heard me talk about sort of the things the statute told us, but it actually doesn't tell us a ton of how to implement this. So we're kind of trying to make it up as we go. In doing that, we'll build out all these pieces. We just don't necessarily hadn't thought it all through, don't have the answer yet. But yes, we want to include that, Kristen.
Great. And just one other comment from Robbie, they are looking to do some outreach to vulnerable communities in 2021 through VDM. So that's just maybe an opportunity for you all to do some more outreach on the Community Flood Fund.
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, there are a lot of levels, as all of you know, to sort of briefing people and kind of synthesizing this with everybody. And my experience is groups like the VFMA were able to get to, you know, advocacy groups of environmentalists, things like that. We can get to the actual people who live in the houses that suffer from flooding on a regular basis. I don't know how much we're talking directly to them. And at least from where I sit, there's a great desire to talk to them more. You know, all sort of stakeholders, but particularly disenfranchised stakeholders who don't necessarily have an opportunity as much. So, you know, that said, if you are doing outreach like that and someone from the governor's office, from my team, can be helpful, please reach out to us. If you have ideas for us about, you know, another webinar or a group we should meet with, or just a person that I should call, you know, please share that either through Kristen or Mary Carson, or Miriam Karad from my office is on this call. She has graciously been handling a lot of our outreach, but know that's something that's really important to us. And if you're able to help, please do. We really could use some help on that front. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. And just so everybody on the call knows, if you you know, have comments or thoughts, VFMA will most likely submit formal public comment on this. So if you're in a position where maybe you don't want to submit formal public comment, or maybe you can't, you can certainly email us comments and things like that. As a VFMA member, you know, we're representing you. I know all of you are not VFMA members, but we're still happy to hear your comment, and we can look into incorporating that as well into our formal comments. Okay, so another question we got, which is from someone in Florida, asked, how long did this concept take to develop and make it through legislature to become state statute?
Faster than you'd think, because Virginia is very, very crazy in how we legislate. So we do, we have a part-time legislature that meets for 45 or 60 days, depending on the year. And so we proposed this at the start of our 60-day session that was in January of this year. And we passed the bill in about 6 weeks.
Yeah, it was crazy fast. So, yeah. Okay.
The development of the master planning framework and things started about 1.5 years ago.
Yeah, and really this initiative started with Executive Order 24, which was released in November of 2018, and that was Governor Northam's kind of first go at all resiliency things, and we've been running with it since then. So,
but that question also raises like an interesting point, I think, which is I firmly believe on my own that Virginia, like pretty much every state in the nation, with the exception of maybe 2, is very behind with regard to flood planning and resilience planning, resilience initiatives. And I think that it's sort of indicative of that many states are standing up to these fairly robust programs fairly quickly.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see, what other questions do we have? And please keep your questions or comments coming in the chat if you have any of them. Oh, and I did want to, Miriam just posted, let me tell everybody as well. If you didn't notice, Miriam posted in the chat a little while ago a link to the RFP. So that was a question near the beginning. The RFP for the Coastal Resilience Master Plan will close on December 30th, 2020. And that link is there as well. And then Miriam also just posted to say, you know, please let them know if you have any ideas or suggestions for outreach or targeted communities. You can, as Josh mentioned, you can email that directly to them. You can send it to us at VFMA. You can send it to Wetlands Watch. We'll make sure whoever needs it gets it. But Miriam did put her email in the chat box for you if anybody has any ideas.
You can also use that email to get to me if if you need follow-up conversations.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. So these are some questions that, for you on the call, the local floodplain managers or anybody else that has any ideas, we're kind of looking for some feedback on. So, as a local floodplain manager, what role do you think the floodplain manager should have in creating and implementing the resiliency plans or the projects for this fund? We sometimes tend to get siloed into the National Flood Insurance Program and the 100-year floodplain, and not necessarily all things flooding. And I don't know if I might be the only floodplain manager whose job is 100% flooding. I know most of you have many other hats that you wear. So kind of thinking about that, and if you have thoughts or ideas right now, please, shout them out, put them in the chat. You can unmute, we can unmute you, and we can have a discussion about it. But kind of thinking about that and providing feedback to the state of what makes sense for you. What do you think we should be doing as part of this? Because we are called out in the legislation directly.
And go ahead, Skip.
Kristen, Josh, I just wanted to sort of make a point that for those of you who are from Bristol and points east, those of you who are from the riverine parts of the state, you really do need to become involved in this process, because the riverine portions of the state have largely been left out of the conversations in developing the underlying pieces for this fund. The Coastal Zone Management Program is giving the coastal PDCs $30,000 a year to increase capacity. A lot of the conversation in the state has been on coastal region. The riverine regions are, in our survey work, and we did a survey of about 70 different localities, the riverine regions in this state are not as far ahead as the rest of the state in being prepared to take full advantage of this fund. So this is a call out to folks in the riverine portions of the state to really, I don't know, pay attention and poke your elected leadership to become involved in this.
I would just add to that, maybe I'm oversharing, but I'm kind of a wildlife nerd. That's how I come to some of this first and foremost. And when the flood control we get to do in the areas Skip just described, that's where we can protect naturally functioning floodplains. That's where we can get incredible, wildlife habitat in our riparian zones and things like that. It can help expand ecotourism to those areas and fishing opportunities and other things. And I think it's so cool, what we can do in areas like that. That's just sort of an aside, but certainly really appreciate that work. And yes, the coastal zone sort of dominates some of the conversations, but we see routine flooding in the non-coastal zone. It's a major priority. And again, while nothing has been set, I think there's a desire to see this money funded equally around the state.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And thank you, Skip, for that call out. I would reiterate that call out. I know I used to work with most of you when I was at the state level, and I'm still fighting for you, even though I'm not on the state level anymore. But, please think about it, because this is a statewide fund, and you on the riverine side on our western part of the state experience just as much flooding as our coastal communities. It just looks different. But you also don't necessarily have all the resources that they have, and certainly not all of the attention that they get. So part of the purpose of today's meeting was to be able to give you an opportunity for that. So if you haven't looked at the draft guidelines yet, please look at them and consider providing comment, whether it's to us or officially through the public comment portal. If you have thoughts, especially about like the staff capacity and the training component for the grants, think about that, because that might be, what you all need first, but also looking at the planning capacity and start talking to the PDCs. We don't all necessarily, I'm a riverine community, but we're also technically in coastal. and Henrico is certainly not the same as a lot of our other communities. We have a lot of resources, but even we don't have a list of projects ready to go. And so that's something that we're kind of trying to figure out of who needs to be at the table. Is it just flooding? Is it public works? Is it planning? Is it our different authorities? Is it, who are all these different people, and thinking about it. So I encourage all of you to be doing this as well and start having these conversations. And it's kind of bad timing because we've got the holidays, so a lot of people are taking vacation, but the public comment period closes at the end of January. So we still got a little bit of time to start thinking about these things. And I believe that the state truly wants to make this something that works for all of us, but they need your feedback to be able to do that.
Kristen, let me say two nerdy things based on something you said a minute back. You were asking about sort of the role of floodplain managers with regard to this fund, and you also mentioned something about the FEMA floodplain, the 100-year floodplain. So two things. First, people suffer flood damage outside of the 100-year floodplain. Anyone on this call probably knows that. For example, Harvey, when it hit Texas, the vast majority of the flooding was not in the FEMA identified floodplain. I think that the state should protect flood risk. We don't necessarily need to be tied to that 100-year floodplain delineation, and would encourage communities when they create resilience plans, if they so choose to look beyond the 100-year floodplain. To me, I think that's good planning. I don't think that's a requirement, but I think that makes sense. So that was the first point. The second point was, what should the role of floodplain managers be? And geez, I don't know. Every workplace is its own dynamics, with different leadership structures and things like that. But here's what I can say is, I believe that floodplain managers come to work with a perspective of stopping flooding first and foremost. And at least in some places, there are other people who come to work in the same building as you, but might have priorities like their first priority every morning is how do I fund this project or this upgrade, or help the tax base, or whatever it might be. And for the project selection for what we'd like to do out of the fund, it's the MO of a floodplain manager. What keeps people and property safe is what we want the primary sort of decision matrix to be. So however it has to happen so that you are informing the applications and the views of a locality so that they meet that test, that's what I would like to see happen. I can't tell you how one does that necessarily because I don't work where you work, but I wanted you to at least hear that notionally that's what I'm going for.
Great, thanks, Josh. Okay. If anybody has any questions or comments, please put them in the chat. We, I think, maybe have answered all of them so far. Other than just having a general discussion, if anybody wants to chime in about what you think the local public manager role should be, or what kind of projects you're interested in, just going through some of the questions we got on the call last week to see if there's anything that we might repeat, that would be useful.
And Kristen, if I just could, while you do that real quick, I see it's very hard for me to look at the chat while I'm doing this, so I apologize, but I see some of you have written private messages to me. I'm not gonna be able to respond to those, but if Miriam could put my email in the chat, I'm happy to respond if you want to email me offline.
Great, thanks for that. And if any of you sent private messages to Josh that would be a question for the whole group, please just copy and paste them back in to the main chat. Okay, here's a new question. What was the previous flood funding mechanism that wasn't successful? Are you referring, Gary, to like what the Community Flood Fund replaced in legislation? Yes. Okay. Do you want to answer that, Josh? Or yeah. Well, this is the Shoreline Resiliency Fund, but
yeah, that's the name of the fund it replaced. But I think if what you're asking is, sort of what's different, the difference is for those of you who work on government programs, is some things come with a mandatory or a tethered funding source to it. So we know the money will be there regardless. And other things are subject to the appropriation of the General Assembly. So out of the complete budget, they need to decide to allocate money. And the problem with the fund before was, while they created the authorizing legislation, they never actually budgeted to put money into it. And we have resolved the problem by creating this dedicated revenue source, so that we don't have to be subject to the whims of the General Assembly or the crush of an economic crisis or anything like that. So that's the main difference, and that's sort of what is good here. One other thing I would just note while we're talking about funding is there are many, I guess now there are a whole bunch of states that are part of RGGI, and the fact that we are using a significant portion of this money for resilience and adaptation is somewhat unique.
Yeah, and just to remind everyone, RGGI is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and so that's going to be, we'll be getting money for auctioning off carbon credits. So that's where the fund is coming from. So just a few things that were discussed on the call from last week that Wetlands Watch hosted that I just want to repeat for everyone to be aware. The resiliency plans came up, and one of the things that was said was just, you know, the state does not want everyone to have to start over for resiliency plans. A plan will be a requirement of the fund to get the grant funding, but they're not wanting you to start over and have to create something from scratch. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something, you know, huge and like, you know, large scale planning, as long as it meets the requirements. So what those requirements look like, we don't know yet. And that would be perfect public comment to provide on what you think makes sense, or what other kinds of plans you already have that maybe could meet that requirement. Josh,
If you are a community that has a plan that you think should qualify, tell us why, but don't just say my plan should qualify. Tell us, say we have a plan and it has X, Y, and Z, and that's why it ought to qualify. Because we won't call out localities, obviously, but we can help build in those minimum requirements such that you will have sort of met them. Similarly, if you are a community that does not have a plan and is going to have to build one, and this sounds scary and onerous, we don't want it to. So tell us kind of what the minimum would be that would adequately help us plan to improve resilience and reduce flooding, but not be super onerous necessarily on the community.
Great, thanks. One other question, the Code of Virginia language says that projects can be available for state or regional significance. Mm-hmm. Do you have anything in mind for how that will be defined, or who decides what constitutes state or regional significance to get that funding?
With regard to state significance, while it's not set in stone, I believe that determination would be made by the Chief Resilience Officer, you know, in the coastal zone, the Special Assistant, and others with the help of DCR. That was the first part. I've forgotten what I was going to say about the second piece. Sorry. Okay.
All right. So would it be helpful for comments to be provided to you on what maybe we think should be considered for criteria for that?
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
If y'all don't tell us and give us good advice, we have to make it up. So please tell us as much as you think we need to know.
Okay. Another question for you is related to the grant rounds and the timings. So you said that there would be 2 grant rounds per year, and the first one was going to be, I forget exactly what the dates were, but it was going to be like April to June, I think, with awards given in August. And then the second round would be August to December with awards given in December. Is there a reason why the first round has 2 months between the end of it and when awards would be given, and the second round they're going to be given as soon as it ends? And how is that going to work with timing? Will there be enough time for the state to review applications and make those awards in the same month?
I think it's probably written a tiny bit clunky right now, and that's something we sort of need to clean up. And, you know, we wanted to give people a sense that we're going to do 2 rounds. sort of one on top of another, and there'll always be a place to apply, but I don't have a good answer for that.
Okay. So if anybody has thoughts on that, provide comment on that as well about my work. And those of you, like VDEM and the local emergency managers who are already reviewing grants and you have programs in place, if you have thoughts on that, please share them, because I think your experience of administering grant programs to do big projects like this will be really helpful in better understanding what timelines and things we need to do. Or FEMA, I know many of you are on the phone as well. Okay. Let's see. Do you have any criteria or anything that will establish what is considered the low income geographic areas that are identified in the legislation?
That's set in the legislation, and I don't have that in front of me, but that is defined, and we'll just use what they told us.
Okay, great. All right, let me just see if I'm missing any other questions. Okay, so we have another question in the chat. In order for localities to apply for grant funding through VDEM and FEMA, a hazard mitigation plan is required, which includes flooding. Would something like this plan qualify for resilience planning, or could this regional hazard mitigation plan be expanded to include resilience planning requirements once those are determined?
So I don't at this moment have enough knowledge of any particular plan or document to tell you whether I think it would be in or out or acceptable or not acceptable. I know that we want to make this so things like that can be acceptable should they meet the needs of some kind of planning framework with some level of green infrastructure or nature-based, et cetera. But I just can't answer it, and we'd have to look to the standards to really answer that question. But again, I recommend that if you think it should count or apply, tell us so in the public comments, and we'll consider that.
Yeah, or if you think that it shouldn't apply and why, tell them that too, of like what you need extra to make it fit.
Did I read that wrong?
No, I'm just adding on to what you were saying. If somebody thinks that maybe it doesn't meet what we think a resiliency plan should be, to explain that, so then that could be added as a criteria. Okay, another question. Is pre-disaster communication with the communities to be affected and building that infrastructure going to be part of the disaster preparedness plan? Influencing the herding tendencies among the communities to be affected may be invaluable.
I love it, but we have not yet had internal conversations about whether or not that should be a requirement of the plan or not. I can tell you that Community Flood Fund money would be available for such a pursuit.
Great. Has the state considered, as we're talking about plans and how many of us have multiple plans that may or may not meet whatever the criteria becomes, has the state considered allowing communities to use multiple plans to meet those requirements? So if we had, components in the hazard mitigation plan and components in our comprehensive plan and maybe a green infrastructure plan, so they're not necessarily all in one place, but overall we might be checking those boxes. Is that something that would be considered as part of the eligibility?
Seemingly, yeah. I can't give a formal answer. I'm not empowered to do that. But here's the bottom line. We want people to be thoughtful about how they do resilience. If you think about the various goals and things I showed you in the master planning framework, right? We want localities to take those into account and create a plan so we can be assured that those things are happening, that we're treating all communities, that we're using nature-based infrastructure, that we're using the best science, all those sorts of things. How we get there, I don't think we're trying to be overly prescriptive. It's a values thing. And if you can show us that those values are being met and that level of planning is happening, I don't care if you write it in crayon.
Okay, thanks.
I mean, like the people you turn it into probably don't want it in crayon, but you get.
Yes. Okay, thank you. So we've got about 20 minutes left. So I want to be, careful of everyone's time. If you do have more questions or comments, please put them in the chat. I'm going to just go through a few of the other things that were mentioned last week while we're waiting on any new questions or comments, just so that everyone knows what was discussed if you missed the meeting last week. And then Josh, if you have anything else to add to these, please feel free to chime in. One of the things that was discussed last week is that the money from this grant is really for more on the ground projects and for like planning and capacity building on the local level. So the PDCs could apply for the funds, but it's intended more for them to be applying on behalf of a locality and not necessarily to conduct a project for themselves. They would be conducting projects for the communities that they represent. So Josh, I don't know if you want to add anything to that if I didn't capture that correctly.
No, look, this is all designed to make sure that money goes to on the ground stuff or to helping a community plan as much as possible. Anytime there is huge sums of money, sort of everybody sees dollar signs, and we just want to make sure that it goes where it can be most impactful.
Yes. And another question that came up last week, kind of similar to this, was that the definition of locality. So the guidelines and everything for this mentions that it's for localities. The Code of Virginia actually defines locality to include cities, counties, towns, commissions, authorities. There are a bunch of different things that fall under that. So that's something that was brought up, that the intent of this is that it would be more for the localities, and PDCs could help them with it, or soil and water conservation districts could help them with it, but it's not necessarily for those other entities to do on the ground projects, unless, they might be the ones in charge of whatever is being implemented. So something to think about if any of you fall under those categories of a local government for the state that's not a city, county, or town, to think about for comment or feedback on this.
And look, we can't be in every city, town, and locality. So if you want to tell us, hey, where we live, Wetlands Watch is the be all end all, they're the ones who do it, and we need to drive money to them, let's have that conversation. But right now, this is sort of what we think was the right first step.
And another comment that was made last week, a question was about private entities. I know we mentioned already on this call that nonprofits and academia haven't been factored in yet, but private entities could be eligible if they were partnering with the locality. So similar to like FEMA grants, the locality would still be the applicant, but they could partner with a private entity to implement some kind of project on that property.
Yeah, and look, part of the thinking there is, we want to make sure that the projects are in concert with the plan that a locality creates. And, a nonprofit group, for example, might want to do other projects and things, and that's great, and that all helps. But, again, even though it's a lot of money, it's not a lot of money, and we want to target it appropriately.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, and then another thing that came up last week was related to whether or not there would be guidelines for the expenditure of funds. Basically, what kind of transparency will there be on the state level for spending funds? If they would be using the grant funding to help support like administrative staff, and then just how the awards are being given. So I don't know if you have any feedback on that, Josh, to share.
Can you distill that down into a clear question for me? I'm sorry.
Will the state have guidelines on how they will be transparent for spending this money?
I don't know if there will be formal guidelines. I know that transparency is important to good governance, and certainly we are subject to FOIA and all those sorts of things. And yes, we want to find a way to ensure accountability and everything. Whether it's guidance or what form it takes, I can't say. I don't know.
Okay, thanks. And then another comment that was made last week was that the guidelines that are out for public comment right now, when those are finished, they will influence the grant manual moving forward every year. So it's very important that the guidelines, fit whatever we need it to fit, because that's going to be steering the program.
I think I started to say this and then lost my own train of thought, but I think, what the goal here is that we're building this really big program. We have to kind of build it in pieces. So we thought we would put out a very broad guidelines, which I presented on today, to help people, the General Assembly and others, get a sense of where we're heading. And then we want to take comment on those, as I discussed. And then we will further refine in our grant manual. And maybe we'll set sort of things that might hold from year to year, but we'll also have the ability to slowly adjust the fund year after year. Maybe we change the cost share because we've finished a certain tranche of projects and we want to move to something else. Maybe our needs change, maybe hydrology changes. I don't know, but yes, the grant manual gives us the ability to kind of tweak things a little bit within the broad parameters set by the guidelines we're discussing.
And you may not have an answer for this yet, but will the grant manual be available for public comment as well? Or are these draft guidelines our only chance to provide feedback to shape this program?
I don't know. I also, with regard to the other grant programs that I'm involved in, across several state agencies and things, it is not typical that the grant manual is put out for public comment, but I just, no decisions have been made.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, and one comment that was made, which if I'm jumping the gun for you guys, Wetlands Watch, I apologize, but Wetlands Watch is going to pull some grant manuals from other states that are going to be on their website that may already be there. Shake your head if they're already there. So if you all want to look at any other grant manuals from other states and get some ideas to help provide comment and feedback on this grant, check out Wetlands Watch's policy page. They're going to be posting updates, and they're doing a lot of kind of the research and the legwork to dig up some things to help with the public comment section of this.
Kristen, if I could, it's so wonderful that it seemingly people from other states have joined to hear a little bit about this. And, I understand you have your own jobs and you're probably not going to submit formal comments and things, but should you have done things like this, or should you have ideas or guidance that you think can help us, we'd still love to hear it, even if it's just, picking up the phone and or a quick email or anything like that.
Great, thanks. And then we have, and Alan, feel free to chime in if you want. This appears to just be more of a comment related to funding for community development block grant disaster funds. The comment is talking about there's $2 billion of this, and this affects Virginia, and that funds must be expended by 2022. So this is just a real-time issue that I think he was bringing awareness to, and that it may be important to extend deadlines so grantees can complete all of their projects. If
I could just add in, thank you very much. This is an important issue because as I mentioned in the chat, this money expires if it's not fully expended by September 30th, 2022. And because of COVID, because some of these projects are very complicated, they're running up against that deadline. So it's important for members of the Senate Appropriations Committee to hear from people, part of a nonprofit organization that helps communities find additional funding for infrastructure related to climate change. And we're encouraging our members to email their senators in the Appropriations Committee to make sure that this is corrected by the end of this week. Thank you for the opportunity to bring this to everyone's attention.
And that's, I'm sorry, so is that Alan, is there something in the Virginia budget that needs to be fixed to address that?
No, it's not in the Virginia budget. This is community development block grant funding, disaster recovery, and it's also National Resilience Disaster Competition funding. There were 11 projects in 10 states. Virginia was one of them. And this money could be lost if these projects are not completed by the statutory deadline that Congress set when it first appropriated the funding.
Understood.
Josh, the project is the Norfolk Chesterfield Heights project. It ran into a bit of a buzzsaw because there was so much construction activity in the state with the tunnel expansion and 95 other things, that it was late getting out of the blocks, and there's an absolute deadline for finishing it by HUD. And so we're trying to get, as the gentleman said, we're trying to get the Congress to extend the deadline. It would be a no-cost extension.
Understood. Thank you. And if the governor's office should reach out to our congressional delegation, I think we'd be happy to talk about that. That said, this is not funding that runs through the Natural Resources Secretariat. And I think I would make a point more broadly to say, you know, I see, you know, we had some friends from VDEM on at least at one point. I'm not sure if they're still on, but there are going to be other pots of money that don't necessarily flow through the rubric I explained today. You know, VDEM in particular, a lot of our pre-disaster mitigation money and BRIC and other things that have come up on this call kind of channel through those places. And, you know, they live outside this to a degree, but I think my hope is that through the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, through the local plans, both in the coastal zone and across the Commonwealth and in the riverine areas, everything like that, that those would help inform these agencies, just like the Secretary of Natural Resources, as we continue to pursue projects and things. So again, while they won't be required to necessarily, you know, use the same funding parameters as we will for the flood fund, I think it helps all of these things kind of pull together better.
That on good point. All of the funding sources, they all can leverage each other. I mean, they're private foundation funding. There's federal highway funding that could be used for projects like this. That's why it's so important to have a chief resilience officer, which Virginia has, which can synthesize and synopsize all of this information.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. All right, so we have about 8 minutes left. I don't see any other questions or comments in the chat. This is last call for any extra comments or questions. But I just want to say thank you again for Josh joining us and providing this update and answering our questions. We really appreciate it. And to Wetlands Watch for letting us use your platform and for constantly being available to do all of this legwork to keep us all up to date on what's happening in our state legislature. Wetlands Watch, did you all want to add anything about your all's website or upcoming outreach events?
Yeah, just wanted to note that there was a question in the chat about where the recording of this meeting will be available. And I just wanted to note that it will be available on the state Virginia State Policy Updates website, or Virginia Policy Updates website, that's been posted in the chat, as well as on the Virginia Floodplain Management Association's website. vaflood.org is the VFMA website, and I think Kristen, you could put that in the chat. Oh, you just did. Okay, great. Email for, there's been a request for Josh, you to include your email in there it is. Okay, Miriam's just posted it. So Josh Sachs' email is in the web, in the chat right now. And then I just wanted to say that Wetlands Watch is facilitating other workshops like this hosted by other organizations and entities that serve different stakeholder groups. And there will be 2 upcoming lunch presentations just like this in January. January 5th will be hosted by the Virginia chapter of the American Planning Association. January 15th will be hosted by the Virginia Conservation Network. And so planners, you should plan to attend the January 5th workshop, where there will be, I think, a larger discussion on what these plans will look like that are threshold requirements for project funding under the Virginia Community Flood Fund. And then on January 15th, the Virginia Conservation Network hosted meeting will be intended to reach conservation organizations, other nonprofits, groups like Wetlands Watch, and other nonprofits that are active in Virginia, and then elsewhere that have some involvement in Virginia's policy work. So those will all be held in the same time frame, noon to 1 to 1:30. And Joshua Sachs will be present at those meetings and will be available to facilitate conversation just like this. So we are really grateful to VFMA. Thank you for your support and leadership in the state. And thank you again to you, Josh Sachs, for being here and presenting for those of us on the call.
Thanks. I just want to say thank you to everyone. I know I'm supposed to sort of do these calls to share information, but I feel like I learn something every time I do one of these, and it helps us to make a better flood fund and a better resilience initiative. So thank you all, and feel free to reach out. I'm happy to keep talking, and thanks. This was great.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And just please share the upcoming events with your other local staff members. Your planners may not necessarily be aware of it. I'm sure APA will be sharing information. We'll keep sharing information about them as well. And like I mentioned before, if you have any thoughts, ideas, comments that you want VFMA to push forward on your behalf, please let us know. Or if you just want to talk, with other local floodplain managers, let us know. We can set up, a discussion with them so that it's just, us talking about things and on our own to kind of figure out what we're interested in. So please keep in touch. I know most of you have my email. You can also email us through VFMA, which I'll put those emails in the chat box as well, or you can contact us through our website or through Wetlands Watch. But thank you all so much for joining us. We appreciate it, and we'll get this recording up on the websites when it's ready. Thanks, everyone.